Close times crossing into the southern no-fly zone. What one Pentagon official called a noticeable step up in harassment is raising new concern Saddam Hussein is testing the resolve of the U.S. and its allies.
Saddam Hussein has been always testing the system of UN constraints, and this has been going on since the fall. Neither the United States nor the UN had any effective reaction.
Meanwhile, the Pentagon confirms it was a $500,000 AMRAAM air-to-air missile like this one that downed the Iraqi MiG. The first combat use of the missile system that was plagued with production problems, and the first time a U.S. Air Force F-16 has shot down another plane in a dogfight. That F-16 and other Air Force planes are based in Saudi Arabia, something the Pentagon doesn't publicly acknowledge because of Arab sensitivity about the issue. Another reason the U.S. wants more carrier-based aircraft in the mix.
Hanging in the balance tonight, a treaty to eliminate the most deadly category of nuclear weapons. U.S. and Russian foreign ministers are in Geneva trying to clinch a deal.
U.S. Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger says he and Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrov will work as hard as we can to complete a new arms agreement between the two countries. But he brushed aside assertions a deal had already been made. U.S. officials said earlier they were encouraged by the discussions held today, adding that there was progress. The latest round of negotiations under the Strategic Arms Reduction, or START talks, strive to eliminate land-based multiple warhead missiles. An agreement would cut down the number of nuclear warheads in the U.S. and former Soviet states by 2/3, from about 20,000 to fewer than 7,000. President George Bush and Russian President Boris Yeltsin have pushed these negotiations ahead during several telephone conversations in recent days. A new arms deal slashing Cold War nuclear arsenals is a way for Mr. Bush to leave his mark in international affairs before he leaves office. But nuclear arms deals, especially this one, pose serious technical questions that must be resolved. U.S. and Russian negotiators sought to do that Monday afternoon in an unusually long session in Geneva that focused on those questions. Still, U.S. officials insist it may be another day before the success or failure of these talks can be assessed.
Opinion polls in Tel Aviv show that 91% of Israelis initially supported their government's decision to deport 415 Palestinians to Lebanon. The polls were conducted the day after the terrorist suspects were banished to a no-man's land ringed by mines and tanks. Since then, the Israelis haven't even allowed food and medicine to reach their makeshift camp.
This is the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, where Palestinians demonstrating against the mass deportation were dispersed by Israeli soldiers firing tear gas and plastic bullets. Despite street protests and growing international pressure, Israel is refusing to relax its hardline stance on the deportees. Arab leaders tried to deliver food to the 415 Palestinians who remain trapped between Israel and Lebanon. But Israeli border guards refused to let the convoy through to the deportees' camp. All the Arab leaders could do was offer prayers for their brothers who are now facing increasingly inhospitable conditions in the no-man's land. The expelled Palestinians were today observing a fast to conserve what food they have. Lebanese sympathizers have smuggled some supplies through to them, but they say there's little more than one day's food left. UN Special Envoy James Jonah met relatives of the deportees. He was hoping to visit the campsite, but first Israel and now Lebanon have refused to allow him access to the security zone.
And from Jerusalem tonight, confirmation that 10 of the Palestinians were expelled in error. Israel says they can return, but they'll have to face trial. When we come back, Sarajevo's worsening plight and the land rights claim the government isn't taking seriously.
It's a claim that simply has not a snowflake's chance in hell of ever being seriously entertained by the courts.
An Aboriginal land rights claim to the entire city of Brisbane was today ridiculed by the Keating government. Federal Aboriginal Affairs Minister Robert Tickner said the claim had a snowflake's chance in hell of success.
The heart of Brisbane is at the centre of the latest land rights claim. The Mulunjali people say they can prove ceremonial and sacred links with all of Brisbane's central business district, and that adds up to around 50 hectares.
That option would then be open to the Mulunjali people to then ask every person living on their land to pay rent, yes.
The claim follows the Mabo ruling, which overturned the long-held view that Aboriginal people had no legal title to land before European settlement. The federal government slammed today's claim and says it has no legal basis and won't succeed.
The fact of the matter is that the High Court of Australia has slammed the door shut absolutely on any kind of claim over privately owned land or land in the central business district of cities. And it is foolhardy and I think dangerous to give Aboriginal people hope that the courts will address their land aspirations where they've been dispossessed absolutely.
The federal government has entered into discussions with the states, the mining industry and Aboriginal groups to clarify the question of land ownership. That process is due to finish by the end of next year. Stephanie Kennedy, 10 Eyewitness News.
Concern for a colony of fairy penguins at Jervis Bay on the New South Wales south coast. The bay is heavily polluted with algae. In the murky water, adult penguins may not be able to hunt food for their young.
The bay became a giant algae pool last week, and for a time it was feared the bloom could be deadly blue-green algae. But tests by the EPA have now confirmed the bloom is not toxic.
There have been small events like this in the past, but nothing this size.
But there's still a problem for the penguins. Park rangers are keeping a constant watch on the birds. The young, dependent on their parents for food, are most at risk.
Seems to be quite healthy. It's got good condition on the chest here, full of life, doesn't like being outside, so we won't keep him too long.
Quite a number of chicks appear to have been abandoned by their adult parents, possibly because they're unable to feed in such murky waters.
A number of dead birds have already been found on Bowen Island, the main breeding ground, but so far there's been no mass starvation.
What we've seen so far is no more than what we've normally encountered on the island over the last few years.
There's little the authorities can do about the murky water conditions. On the positive side, experts say the breeding season this year has been very good, and many of the penguin young are already able to fend for themselves in the bay. Guy Bevanakwa, 10 Eyewitness News.
United Nations forces in Bosnia have expressed alarm at a build-up of Muslim forces on a mountain overlooking Sarajevo. They believe it could be an attempt to break the Serbian siege. The threat of an all-out assault coincides with the onset of winter. Sarajevo's most vulnerable residents have begun dying in the icy cold.
It used to be rather luxurious. Now a lot of it has been closed down because of war damage. There's a hard job just keeping one room on each floor heated. Snipers in the building behind make it dangerous even to get fuel. In the past few months, several of the staff and patients have been killed or wounded. Since it lies beside the Serbian lines, Serbian soldiers use its corridors as a shortcut to their positions. Watch out for snipers, he says. But the real enemy is the cold. 8 of the old people here have died in the past 4 days from hypothermia. This elderly woman would, the nurses said, be dead by tonight. Others huddle under their skimpy blankets, trying to keep warm. It's clean and well looked after, but there aren't enough blankets and there aren't enough stoves, so the wards are unheated. And there's nothing to stop the cold getting in. The snipers have seen to that. There used to be 100 staff here. Now there are only 6 to look after 120 old people. They've stayed from a sense of duty. If you could ask the outside world for help, I said, what would you want? Heating, clean sheets, and more nurses, they said. It's a dreadful way to end a long life. This woman is dying, and perhaps the last sound she hears is a sniper's rifle.
You may not have heard much about Kosovo. It's a province on Serbia's southern border. Fighting could spread there from Bosnia.
The Bush administration is threatening to use force if the violence in the Balkans spills over into Kosovo, a province of mostly ethnic Albanians. President Bush has sent a message to Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic and the commander of the Yugoslav army. It says, in part, the U.S. will be prepared to use military force against the Serbs in Kosovo and in Serbia proper if the Serbs decide to move into the province. Officials worry that an invasion of Kosovo, a formerly autonomous province southeast of Bosnia-Herzegovina, would bring Albania and other countries into the ethnic battle and end any hopes for a peace agreement. Serbs consider Kosovo an integral part of their national pride. It's the site of 5 historic monasteries and a major battle with the Turks in the 14th century. United Nations Secretary General Boutros Ghali is also meeting with officials of the former Yugoslavia to talk about possible U.S. or other nations' unilateral military action. The question is, will the fighting factions take the threat seriously?
They've been committing aggression for month after month in Bosnia, and we've sat on our hands and done absolutely nothing to oppose it. And now we send them a letter saying, well, if you go on to the next territory, watch out. I'm not sure they're going to believe us.
Next, will Bondi become a user pays beach? And what odds Australia in the MCG test?
Oh, that's got him now. That's well bowled by Merv Hughes.
Australia has a tight grip on the second cricket test against the West Indies in Melbourne. The Windies finished day 4 at 1 for 32 in their second innings, chasing 359 for victory. Earlier, Australia struggled to 196 in their second innings. A defiant 67 from Damien Martin held the side together.
Australia's batsmen were always going to face a tough day on a cracking and increasingly unpredictable pitch. First to go was night watchman Shane Warne.
In the air and out.
1 run later, Steve Ward left Australia struggling at 3 for 41.
Oh, he's gone! What a good catch there by Simmons in the gully. Ward has gone for the big cut shot there.
The Windies sensed a chance and should have had Taylor on 22.
Dropped him.
Taylor and Mark Waugh showed glimpses of getting on top, but were never comfortable.
And that's in the air.
And it was no surprise when Waugh fell for 16.
Shouts of catch it, and that's exactly what Jimmy Adams has done.
Australia's woes continued after lunch when Bishop ended Taylor's stand.
Oh, well, it's hit the stumps.
Alan Border was next to go for 4. Australia in trouble at 6 for 102. Curtly Ambrose ensured he kept cool before Courtney Walsh claimed Australia's 7th wicket. Ian Healy.
Yeah, Courtney Walsh, the bowler, has got it.
But while his teammates tumbled, Damien Martin took on the quicks to push Australia's lead over 300. And he received aggressive support from Merv Hughes.
No one out there. It's over the top. It's 6.
The tail end held on to help Martin to a well-deserved 50 and take Australia to a 358-run lead. With more than a day to reach their big target, the Windies started cautiously. But it wasn't long before Hughes again made the early breakthrough.
Oh, that's got him now. That's well bowled by Merv Hughes.
Haynes's dismissal for 5 was a disastrous start. But Phil Simmons and Richie Richardson carried the score through to stumps.
Stumps that through cover. That's a fine shot, but it'll go all the way.
Both batsmen showed they weren't going to be tied down and are set to take up the challenge to Australia's bowlers on the final day. James Knight, 10 Eyewitness News.
Maxi Ketch New Zealand Endeavour today became one of only 4 yachts to win the Sydney to Hobart Classic in less than 3 days. She sailed into Hobart's Constitution Dock, completing an impressive debut and sparking traditional victory celebrations.
And New Zealand Endeavour takes line honours in the 1992 Kodak Sydney Hobart Yacht Race.
No record time for New Zealand Endeavour, but an impressive debut. She crossed the finish line 5 hours outside Kealoha's 1975 record, but still managed the 3rd fastest time in the race's 48-year history.
We had quite a bit of breeze some of the time, and so, you know, it was a good chance to see where things would go wrong. Nothing really went wrong.
3.5 hours later, Sydney's Amazon finished. Owner Peter Walker was disappointed the race rules wouldn't allow him to carry full-size sails.
I feel that had we been able to carry the proper sail area, we'd be able to keep up in the light patches. I'm not saying we would have won, but it would have been more of a race.
For New Zealand Endeavour, the Sydney to Hobart was a dazzling warm-up for next year's Round the World race in her first taste of ocean racing. Mark Gillies, 10 Eyewitness News.
Bondi Beach, Australia's most famous strip of sand, might become Sydney's first user pays beach next Christmas. The large crowd of revellers who went there last Friday left such a mess that the local council is considering a charge of $2 a head next year. That would more than cover the clean-up bill this Christmas of at least $20,000. The council says it would not have to consider imposing the fee if the state government helped with costs. But a spokesman for New South Wales Tourism Minister Minister Bruce Baird says the clean-up is a council cost, even though Bondi is a state tourist attraction. Well, it may be a question on your mind. What's going to happen to your Christmas tree when you finish with it? You wouldn't have a problem in the US state of Louisiana. Your Chrissy tree would be recycled.
Traditionally, they're picked up by garbage companies and trucked to landfills, contributing to the landfill overcrowding problem. But now, in more than 12 coastal Louisiana parishes, the trees have become a treasure. The state has instituted Project Yuletide to recycle the trees, to use them as barriers to stop erosion in bayous and bays.
The trees are just act as a barrier to calm the water and just let the sediment drop out.
Milton Comm started the first Christmas tree recycling program 4 years ago. The real testament to his work is how a once eroding shoreline began developing a new mud bank. Skeptics quickly became believers, so Project Yuletide was extended. Perhaps one of the biggest undertakings has been in the Barataria Basin, once home and hideout for the pirate Jean Lafitte.
This is a haven for fish and shrimp and crab, and it's probably one of the best estuaries for seafood in the nation.
Last year, tens of thousands of trees were transported by barge into the basin, where volunteers put them into place. This year, 300,000 trees will be put to use there. Recycled trees, which will offer benefits for years to come.
Looks like a good idea. Ahead, weather around the nation and the cathedral that's still being built 100 years later.
Then, but I just have to keep Westminster Abbey in front of my eyes.
Around the country, fine today in all the capital cities, although Melbourne and Perth were a little hazy. Brisbane did the best with a top of 30 degrees. On the satellite picture, little cloud except for a minor front moving across from Western Australia. This may bring some thunderstorms to northwestern New South Wales on Saturday. The synoptic chart for tomorrow shows a high over the Bight that's slowly ridging into the Tasman. This is bringing warmer northerly air to the inland. The fine conditions should persist into the new year. All the capitals will remain fine tomorrow. Brisbane on top with 28 degrees, Canberra and Adelaide next best with 27, elsewhere 26. Over the next few days, Brisbane, Sydney and Canberra will all stay fine and warm. Adelaide getting hotter, Melbourne and Perth also a fine start to 1993. On the international front, Rome a clear 12 degrees. New York's Cathedral St. John the Divine has been 100 years in the making and it's still not finished. But that hasn't stopped it becoming a unique place of worship for people from all walks of life.
The Cathedral of St. John the Divine has never done things in the traditional sense, but some things are less traditional than others. This is a ceremony to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the day construction began on this, the largest of the world's cathedrals.
Medieval urban cathedrals were living cathedrals, and that is what St. John's was called to be from its inception.
St. John was also called on to be a cathedral of all the people from its inception. The cathedral is Episcopalian, but sacred objects from other religions are there too. And people of other religions and customs have always been invited to have their own services. This past Thanksgiving, Native Americans held a special prayer service. And last year, the Dalai Lama led the congregation in prayer. The diversity isn't limited to people. Every year, animals of all types are brought to the cathedral for a special blessing. Parishioners here are proud of the diversity. Construction began on the cathedral shortly after the cornerstone was laid in 1892. By the early 1900s, the cathedral was taking shape. The plan was for the finished cathedral to look just like this. But 1 century later, the unfinished cathedral looks like this. And it's still conceivable that in another 100 years, it still won't be finished.
I hope to God it's finished then, but I just have to keep Westminster Abbey in front of my eyes. And it was started in the 10th century, and the western towers were put on in the 19th century.
They hope they don't have to wait 900 years here in New York. But for now, they're just thinking of this particular day.
I guess there's no real hurry. That's 10 Eyewitness News for the last Tuesday in 1992. More news at 6 o'clock in the morning when they'll still be talking about the bargain hunting scramble that continued today at major Australian stores. We'll leave you now with more of those scenes. From all of us here at 10 Eyewitness News, I'm Sandra Sully. Good night.